thank you so much for making times in your busy lives to come here. Hopefully the next 90 minutes will be worth your while. I've done similar presentations, one last year describing the Somes Heritage Area and what's involved there. So I'm going to assume you know at least a little bit about it. If you want to know more, the easiest way to find out is to simply go on the somesheritagearea.org website, which is on the brochures that are at the back table there, and you can learn more about it. In fact, if you go to the event page and scroll down, you can see the presentation I did here a year ago. Okay, and I do video of all of these, so this one will be on as well, and if you have friends and neighbors who missed it, they can still see it on video. Okay? So, let me get started, because we have a lot of territory to cover. We've got about 10,000 years to cover. I think we can get that in the next 90 minutes here, somewhere along the line there. Just to explain how I got started on this project, I live here in Warren. This is Burrs Hill Park. My house is back in the trees there in one corner. When I get up in the morning, I look out my bedroom window and I see Burrs Hill Park. And one morning, I discovered that they were digging a hole there. And I thought, what is going on? So I went over and asked and found out that they were reburying the Massasoit who met the Pilgrims in 1621. There's the mystery. What were they up to? Okay. This is the Massasoit. Before you leave, make sure you get a look at the painting that's right behind the desk over there. It's this painting here. That painting is now incorporated into a historic marker that will be placed at Burrs Hill Park down in this area. The marker is going to explain why Oso McClendon was reburied there 2 years ago in 2017. And you will learn that he was originally buried there shortly after his death in 1661. We believe up in Brookline, and his body was brought back here because this was one of 2 royal burial grounds for the Pokanoket tribe. And that's where he was interred, and Virginia Baker describes finding in one of the graves back before the turn of the 20th century evidence from the lace on this red horseman's jacket and this necklace, copper chain necklace, that was in a gravesite there. And that almost confirms for certain that that was Oso McClendon, that he would not have been giving those. And those were typical objects that were buried with people, things that were of importance that they need to take to the next life. So you will, after May 16th, when we dedicate this, you'll be able to go over there and read about what happened at Burrs Hill Park, as it was a native burial ground long before any of the Europeans arrived here. The Massasoit, Oso McClendon. Okay. I say the Massasoit because that's his title, not his name. It's like president. Okay. Oso McClendon, meaning yellow feather, was first met the Pilgrims in March of 1621. Not really at the time that they arrived in December, because at that point in time, the native people were very wary about Europeans because they had just suffered greatly loss of people in 3 years prior to the Pilgrims' arrival. And they were kind of very hesitant to get close until they knew what was going on. We celebrate the Thanksgiving as a symbol of mutual friendship, but there's a lot more to the story, and it's not quite as described in your 4th grade textbook, let me tell you. So this presentation is really going to help you understand the history of cooperation between Oso McClendon and the Pokanoket tribe and the Pilgrims or separatists who came here. The name Pilgrim, by the way, wasn't used till the 1800s. as I said, we have a lot of history to cover because people have been living here for 10,000 years or more. Ever since the glaciers receded in about 12,000 years prior, people had occupied this area continuously, and as far as we know, successfully, without famine or without periods of time when they disappeared or anything of that sort. This is continual occupation over that time. And until the 1500s, when traders and fishermen began arriving along the coastline here. The area that the Pokanoket tribe occupied, and I know most of you are familiar with the name Wampanoag. The name Wampanoag never appeared in any written form until 1702. That was a name assigned to the tribe after the King Philip War. So if you look at any map prior to that time, you will see Pokanoket. That territory extended not only down here where we are in Rhode Island, East Bay, but all the way up to the Charles River, where the Massachusetts Indians were, and well over to the border of Providence. And it included both Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. That was Pokanoket Territory and comprised nearly 60 sub-tribes in that area, all under the leadership of the Massasoit. We have lost our native names here, but we're on Kasumsa. That was the native name, which now has become Warren. But if you look at Bicknell's map, he does a good job of describing what these lands were called by the people who lived here the longest. The Separatists showed up here after traders who had come along the coast, but what was different about the Separatist arrival was that they brought women and children and intended to stay. Prior to that time, the traders would be here for a few days, a few weeks, and then leave. And they also left their women and children at home. So when women and children arrived at Patuxet, or what we call Plymouth, Oso McClendon's scouts said, there's something going on here that we need to pay attention to. This is a different group of people. And not a very hardy group of people, by the way. Remember, 50 of the 102 people who came on the Mayflower had died by the following March. They were in terrible shape. And had it not been for the help of Oso McClendon and his people, there's a very good chance that they would have left, returned to England, abandoned the whole project. If you want to get a sense of what life was like, has anybody seen the Colonial House series? It's a PBS series. Ran, I think it was produced in 2004. You can get it on YouTube now, all 8 shows. And there's a link on the Somes Heritage Area website. If you go to videos and scroll down, you'll find this picture. Click on it and it'll take you to a link to all of those videos. And I've just been enjoying it over the last week or so. I never heard of it. But it's this whole group of people who volunteered to redo the experience of the Mayflower. They said it in 1628. This was a little village that was created for them with 4 houses up in Maine. They arrived there in June, stayed until September, and they were charged with what the Pilgrims had to do, which was survive, but also produce economic goods that could be sent back. Because the Mayflower pilgrimage was part religious, but also, just as importantly, economic. It was critical that that group return to their investors things of value. They first looked at fish, they also looked at lumber, but then found out that furs were the best deal for the money, and did a lot of trading, including up as far as Maine, with native people here who could bring the furs and then trade for the English goods that the native people wanted to have. first encounter then between Oso McClendon was in March of 1621, and that occurred when two of the so-called Wampanoags, they weren't Wampanoag then, they were Pokanoket, appeared in the village to ask a favor. Could they meet with the Massasoit? And through a series of exchanges, they discovered that the Indians spoke some English. How did native people in Patuxet learn English? Well, one of them learned Somerset learned from the traders along the coast. When you do trading, you've got to be able to talk. So he learned English over a period of time. And then to Squantum, or what we know as Squanto, had been captured in 1614, taken to Europe and Spain, eventually made his way to England, and found his way onto a ship that brought him back in 1619. So he was already there ahead of the Pilgrims, walks into the village speaking English, welcome Englishmen, and they were just shocked that here was a native person speaking understandable English. But he became a critical person in terms of negotiating a contract, if you will, between the tribe and the Puritans, separatists. There were, that in England everybody was Puritan if you were Protestant, but only some were separatists. The separatists thought the Puritans weren't pure enough, so they came from Scrooby through Boston, eventually over to Leiden, and here on the Mayflower. So the Indians told the colonists that Massasoit was nearby with his brother and 60 men. They were, of course, there to show force because they didn't know what was going on when they heard the Pilgrims shooting their guns. They were afraid that they were about to make war on them, so that's why they showed up. But when they learned that there was an interest in talking and negotiating a treaty at the time, they sat and worked things out, then came back significantly on April 1st, April Fool's Day, to sign that treaty. And I only say that jokingly because if you look at the rest of the history, some people would say, maybe Massasoit shouldn't have struck that deal. At the time of the treaty, it had only been 4 months since the Mayflower landing. They were living in temporary dwellings. The first winter was brutal. Half of them died, as I mentioned. But the indigenous people were also suffering because in the 3 years prior to the landing in 1620, 90% of their population were killed by contagious diseases brought over from Europe. So when the Pilgrims arrived in Patuxet, they found nothing but bones on the ground because there was nobody left alive to bury the dead. What remaining native people were there had left the area, so it was abandoned. Well, of course, if you're English and you're there on a religious mission, you believe that that's a sign from God that He has prepared the way, right? So they thought nothing of moving into that land. The land was cleared, ready for planting, and they were able to set up a fairly successful village for the next 10 years there. The people, the Wampanoag or Pokanoket, who were remaining, were mostly in this area. We're in Solms now. Solms means the southern area, principally Bristol, Warren, and Barrington. When you walk out of this building, and you walk by Town Hall, look up above the door. You will see a frieze, a sculpture, if you will, at the front of the building that says Solms 1621, with a profile of a Western Indian headdress. They didn't know exactly what they were doing in 1890, but Warren was known as Solms, the home of the Massasoit. And that's one of the reasons that we're doing this project, is to bring that history back so people understand that. Well, here the Massasoit was living in this area, probably a settlement, some believe down on the end of Baker Street where there's a spring. We don't know for sure, but he knew that he was going to have to do something to keep the Narragansetts, who were just over the river, Providence River, from invading. They had already moved in on the territory that's now Providence, which is why Canonicus was so readily able to give Providence to Roger Williams when he landed, because that had not been their habitual land there. The Massasoit was concerned that the Narragansetts would want to move into the area, especially for the abundant food supply here and great territory. This is a wonderful place to live. But he needed to protect his people with only 60 warriors left after that great dying. Well, he thought for a while and said, I'm going to make an alliance with the English, because even though they're not great in numbers or military might, they have guns and cannons, and I can use that to our advantage. So that's what he did. He struck this agreement, there's 6 points to it, basically saying, I won't harm you, you won't harm me. If somebody tries to harm you, we'll come to your defense, and vice versa. Okay. Few other points of this, but lastly, King James would be ruler over all of us, which was something that the Massasoit really probably did not understand entirely what that was all about, but he respected the idea that if the Pokanokets have a leader, as he was, then the English must have a leader, and that would be the king. So, over 50 years, we had cooperation. A remarkable period of cooperation, one that hadn't developed down the Chesapeake area with Roanoke, and then the settlement at Jamestown, where there was not a mutual understanding of support. A number of the colonists were killed, and there were serious skirmishes. In fact, many of them went back after a few years. So by the time of 1620, you had some knowledge that maybe you better get along with people who lived here, because it's going to determine your fate. And the English were amenable to the idea of working with the native population here, not only for the goods that they could provide, but for the mutual protection that they would afford against other tribes, including the Narragansetts. So cooperation extended into shared knowledge about the land, shared goods, and a notion that justice would be handled by each side. In other words, if an English person did something that needed to be adjudicated, the English would take care of it, and vice versa for the Pokanokets. And they began to spell out sale agreements or deeds for the land, but we're going to talk about that in just a minute. You have two differing worldviews between these two groups. Okay, they have different languages. Okay, and the Algonquin language was not a Romance language or a Germanic language like what the different types of governance, differing views of history, or how you think about the past. Religions celebrated differently, the value of work seen differently, the notion of living with the land versus living on the land, hunting animals versus raising them, managing land, not acquiring it, having use agreements, not purchases, and acceptance of what can't be controlled versus being ruled by the forces of good and evil. Now, many of these ideas come from both William Cronin and Mary Ellen Lepakota, who both do terrific writing about some of the differences between these two groups. So if you want to do some more research, I would suggest you look into their writing. But we're going to go through these, starting with languages. As I said, the Pilgrims spoke English, which has both Latin and Germanic roots, and meaning is conveyed through a combination of nouns and adjectives and adverbs and verbs, right? That's how you put a sentence together: subject, verb, pronoun, etc. Okay, and the notion of written documents is holding legal authority. It's not what somebody says; it's what they signed on a piece of paper, and what that piece of paper can do is go beyond the person's lifespan. So something that somebody signed, then they pass away, the paper is still in force. Pokanoket, speak an Algonquin language. I'm not a language expert, but I know it has no Germanic or Latin roots. If you get a chance to read Roger Williams' Key to the Languages of America, you will notice when he does translations of various phrases. For example, if you want to say, I speak another language, we have 4 words to say that. I speak another language, right? But in the Algonquin dialect, there's one word that says all of that. And that's how their language worked. That you learned not combinations of words, but phrases, if you will, longer words that contain within them the idea. Okay, both subject and verb. Okay, and they had no writing, though we believe there were some documents on bark that may have been written prior to the King Philip War. Whatever there was has been burned and lost, and the language itself is only being recovered now through the efforts of a project out of Harvard where they recovered the language that was written in a Bible that was translated in the 1640s that took Native people writing the Bible phrases in their native language. So that served as a key that could be used to recover the language, and that process is going on right now down on Cape Cod. Translation was critical because of the differences in language, and I don't know how many of you speak another language, but you certainly are familiar with the notion that how you say something in one language changes when you try to say the same thing in another language, because they don't translate entirely in equivalent terms. So even though you can translate something, you miss a lot of the nuances. And that, if you can imagine that going on from 1621 onward, there were all kinds of differences in understanding, particularly when it came to explaining things like treaties, deeds, and other documents. Callaway and Salisbury say that the very act of translation was an act of colonialism. When you think about that, how things were translated changed the way we view history. Types of governance. Pilgrims were ruled by a monarchy, but attempted democratic reforms. If you're familiar with the history of England, you know that there was huge changes over this period of time in England between the king and then Parliament being disbanded, then brought back. Their governance was a mess, to put it mildly, and all kinds of conflicts, 2 long-lasting civil wars there. All of that was occurring while this was going on over here. Church and government acted together as a single authority. And despite what we've learned later from Roger Williams and a different way of understanding things, it was clear to the separatists that there is only one authority, and that's the church. It was also clear to the Puritans who came into the Boston area in 1630 that you cannot separate the rule of law from God's law, and the two go together. Individual rights have been secured a century before in the Magna Carta, but there were many different interpretations of that. It was just a beginning idea of an individual having rights, versus the authority of the church. Pokanokets, on the other hand, were led by a single leader, but that leader was not someone who was specifically elected. It wasn't somebody who had a rule of law, in a sense, but he governed by consensus. That meant that the other sub-chiefs under him, remember those 60 chiefs in the whole Pokanoket area, had to essentially agree with his decisions. There was dissent, including dissent about whether they should ally with the English, but overall, when he spoke for the entire tribe. All tribal members were guaranteed to be taken care of, and that's an important element here, that when we look at the English versus the native view of society, we see differences. Different views of history. Assuming you're European, you see history as a progression of events over time, right? We think of timelines and things of that sort. We think of things happening before something else happens and something comes after that. In the Algonquin view of things, history is not a series of events one after the other. What you understand the past as is more what we would call a myth, in the sense that it would be stories that explain events over time. And though you might talk about a past battle, you didn't have a history of every battle going way back. You would talk about leaders and their personality and what made them great, but there wasn't a sense, or there didn't seem to be a need to have a progressive history down through time. What you do is you relate stories that carry the message about certain values that the tribe has. That was history. It's a different way of understanding the past. The English recorded historical events, obviously in writing. The Pokanoket history was oral. So things had to be repeated and stories had to be told over and over again and passed from one generation to another. Think about what happened in the Great Dying in 1616 when 90% of the people died, including many of the historians, the elders in that group. They lost a considerable amount of their history in the death of those people. That history to this day has not been recovered. So much of, when you talk with people from the tribe today, the history they describe is what they've learned from the English written history, not so much from their own oral history, which they lost. English saw history as embedded in Christianity and the Bible in particular, okay? That the way the separatists were interpreting everything was through biblical stories. Okay? They even thought, for instance, that the native people here might have been part of the lost tribes of Israel, because that was the lens that they were looking at everything with. So if you couldn't find it, a reference in the Bible, it never happened. Okay. Pokanokets, on the other hand, saw history embedded in their traditions and beliefs and customs. And that was what was important to carry from one generation to the next. Different views of religion. The Native Americans drew no sharp division between natural and supernatural phenomena. They were pretty much one and the same. Most people today like to think of themselves as rational beings, right? Maybe you have a belief in spirits, but it's something you wouldn't talk to a lot of people about. Well, that was normal discourse among the people who lived here. They saw no reason to distinguish between spiritual reality and what we would call scientific reality. The two were merged together. There was a three-part universe: the sky and the world above, the world we occupy, and the lower world. Not to be confused with hell. Okay? It was simply a place that was occupied by certain spirits and beings. and one that there was a need to be in touch with as often as possible. You want to be able to do that. So they were oriented toward the sky and the position of the stars. How many people have been out to look at the stars lately? Oh, good. A few folks. Okay. It's not a usual habit now. Okay. In fact, it's very difficult to see them in most places, unless you live in Towissett. Okay. But the Native people were up every night looking at that bright sky with those stars and knew a lot about the changes in position and assigned meaning to the constellations, similar to the kinds of things that we know with Ursula Minor, etc. If you go up on Route 136, across from Johnson's Market, anybody been by there? Okay, look across the street, now that there's no shrubbery in the way, but just over the fence you will see this stone. The geologists describe that as a glacial erratic, just deposited by the glaciers. But when I said to the state archaeologists, I said, this isn't just deposited somewhere. There's stones underneath it. This people put there. That wasn't a glacier who put those stones underneath it to hold it up. So clearly somebody put that there. It's also on top of a geologic outcropping of granite there. And it's at the top of a knoll that was described as Sachem's Knoll, Chief's Knoll. It's across the street from another rock along the west side of the street that was known as the National Grinding Mill, or King's Rock there. Okay, kings for kings of the native tribes. And there's a groove in the middle of that rock. If you climb up there, you can see where native women would grind corn, etc. This is a spiritual place. Okay, this isn't just some rock. And it was likely, I believe, placed there by native people as a ceremonial rock, pointing in certain directions, okay, that helped them orient and connecting them with the spirit world and the underworld beneath them. Okay. One of these days we're going to get that rock interpreted. In the meantime, rituals all help them connect themselves with the spirit world. You have to keep those worlds in balance, and rituals are maintained to keep those connections in balance. Everything is identified as animate. Okay, it has a spirit, if you will, and is endowed with a mana-like spirit power called Manitou. Anybody ever heard the term Manitou? Okay. There's a book by John Salisbury called Manitou in Providence. It's a great book. It talks about the Pokanokets, not the Wampanoags, and talks about that whole spirit interface. Here you have English people coming with kind of the Bible filter, meeting with a group of people who have a Manitou filter. Everything they saw and perceived in both the natural and the human world was interpreted as Manitou, bringing spirit. What kind of spirit do you have? You can increase power. It can be decreased, lost or found, transferred. It can cause physical transformations that work magically for good or bad. I don't pretend to have gotten myself completely involved in that, but if you can imagine a whole different way of seeing the world, very different than we do, and then encountering another whole different way of seeing the world, that, unless you're a separatist and practicing that, that few people today understand. Here you have these two cultures trying to understand one another. So kinship, totems, visionary experiences and dreams, dream interpretation, special talents and skills, luck and success in forming relationships, all of this are combined in this 24/7 spiritual world of the native people. The English only accepted Christianity as a true religion. The Indians were regarded as heathen unless they converted, and they were described as such, including our friend Roger Williams, who called them heathen. He attempted probably better than anybody at the time to understand the spiritual beliefs, but probably didn't get everything right. And the colonists were working actively, particularly starting in 1650, to do conversion. That was supposed to be what they were going to do when they first came. They got busy with a lot of other things, and it wasn't until John Eliot came over to the Mass Bay colony that there was the beginnings of serious attempts to convert native people, including the erection of, I think, 14 towns all over the area. Probably the most familiar one is Natick, which was known as a praying town. It was a town that was established for native people who would convert to Christianity. And remember, conversion wasn't just a matter of belief. It wasn't a matter of saying you had some spiritual experience. It was changing how you dress, cutting your hair, changing what you eat, how you talk, on and on and on. It's the closest description we can come to today of genocide, cultural genocide. It was an attempt to take a whole group of people and transform them into, if you will, Europeans of the time. Did it work? Not very well. Some converted. We believe many converted simply because they thought they would be in less danger if they did. They found out, however, during the King Philip War that it didn't matter. If you had converted, you were still sent to Deer Island to starve to death. So it was a strategy that backfired in some ways. Praying towns, established by the colonial authorities to control populations, etc., as I just described. And throughout the 18th century, even natives living outside of praying towns, Massachusetts provincial authorities continued to insist on appointing or approving all Indian leaders. This is after the King Philip War, and approving all laws and ordinances enacted by Indian people. In effect, they regulated all relations between native people and non-Indians. I mean, this was total control, okay? And this is the inheritance that we have today. Different views of work. I assume most of you have worked outside the home at some point in time, right? And I assume it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, whether you worked outside the home, right? Well, the colonists had a different view of that, okay? They thought that woman's place was where? In the home, okay? And man's place was where? In the field or on the military field. But that separation in terms of where you did your work and who did work was very different from how native people saw that division. Women did take care of the home in many respects and did care for children, but they were the ones doing the gardening, okay, not the men who, the colonists insisted that that native men should be out there working in the field, if not with the native women, exclusively in the field, okay? Whereas native people saw the role of men as primarily hunting and warfare and defense, okay? Hunting and fishing. So native men would go out for sometimes days or weeks at a time to hunt and fish, and then come back to the village. And what do you do after you've been out there for a while? You rest, right? So that's what they would do. Meanwhile, the native women are laboring with cultivating the three sisters, the corn, squash, and beans. And the English colonists walk in to those settlements and say, what's going on here? These lazy men doing nothing while the women are working, doing what men should be doing. Okay, totally different worldview. Okay, and you add to that the effect that animals were understood quite differently. Did native people feed wild animals?
No. Yeah.
No. They had one domesticated animal. You know what that was? Dogs. Right. And that was it. They had never thought of the idea that you would provide food for an animal, domesticate it, and then slaughter it for your own food. Never occurred. Never occurred. Okay. So within a year after the separatists arrived, they began seeing these animals, cows, pigs, etc., and wondered, what are they? They had no word for them. There's a story about them coming upon a cow that was kind of disabled out in the field. They had no idea what it was, thought it was a large dog because it's the only thing that they could relate to, and didn't understand what it was for. So they would sometimes kill animals like they'd kill any other animal. If you're out hunting and you see an animal that, you kill it. And of course the English didn't like that. Animals in the native way were not necessarily subordinate beings. They had Manitou just like people had Manitou, and you were reverent in killing an animal in the wild. Okay, you gave thanks to the Creator before you did that, and you were very careful to make sure that you used every part of that animal because it was a gift to you. I doubt that Puritan Pilgrim farmers thought of their animals as a gift and gave thanks before they slaughtered them. They might have been happy that they were able to feed them, but other than that, Native people saw animals as linked to people in the spiritual world, and spirits might appear in the guise of animals. So they were used to having apparitions of animals that were represented their ancestors, for instance. Native people saw themselves materially and spiritually as belonging to the land. Okay, belonging to the land, being a part of the landscape. In fact, Native people didn't have a name for themselves. And we talk about the Pokanoket tribe. Technically, it's the people from the land of Pokanoket, because no one in the tribe called themselves by a tribal name. They were simply the people. Okay? When the Europeans needed a name, they had to assign something. Okay? And eventually came up with this Wampanoag idea. What is this you call property? Says Oso McClendon, it cannot be the earth, for the land is our mother, nourishing all her children, beasts, birds, fish, and all men. The woods, the streams, everything on it belongs to everybody and is for the use of all. How can one man say it belongs only to him? Okay, just a totally different view. Okay? I could get into, socialism, communism, etc. But essentially, the people who were living here lived communally. The possession, if you possessed anything, it was possessed by all. There was no sense of individual ownership of anything. If you needed it, it was provided for you. The English view, nature was alien, something to be subdued. Okay, read that in Genesis. To be defended against, conquered, just like the homeland of England and other comparative countries of Western Europe had been conquered since the time of Rome. That was the whole idea of warfare, was to conquer and obtain land. More than anything else, it was the treatment of land and commodities as commodities that distinguished the English conceptions of ownership from the Indian ones. There's a great book by Cronin called I'll think of it in a minute, where he talks about that whole notion of land ownership. So what is land? In the settler's mind, land was property, real estate, and capital. To the Pokanoket, land was their own identity, who they were. You could not separate the person from the land. It was the home of their kinfolk. Their history is tied up in the land. The land is where you get medicines. The land is a veritable library of information. Land is a gift, not a commodity that can be bought or sold. So, whole different view again. Land ownership. Colonists wanted all the land to be accounted for and bounded, though it was usually held in common. Most of the land that colonists had was common land, like the town common, but individuals were assigned parcels of land as well. ownership belonged to the king as the supreme owner of all the land, and that's why the king had to give you a patent in order to come to this country and establish land. It really was the king's land that you were governing over that time. You could occupy the land by freemen, commoners, tenant farmers, indentured servants, slaves, and Native Americans. Okay? These are all different categories of people in a very hierarchical society, one where everyone knew their place, and your place didn't change over your lifetime. You were born into your place, you remained in that place. The Indians, on the other hand, did in time understand this notion of land purchase. And when you see deeds that began right around here in 1653, when Solmes and parts adjacent where you're sitting now was purchased from Oso McClendon, that land ownership was understood as what's called usufruct, or the right to use the land for certain purposes, not ownership in the sense of possession. So you might be given the use of the land to for salt marsh hay, or for fishing, or for travel through here, but no one was to own the land, and that's where discrepancies occurred between the English notion of this is my land, I will put a fence around it. Native people never fenced anything. And then the idea that you can't cross into my territory, whether I'm using it or not, doesn't matter, I own it. Okay? Whereas Native people were used to using land accordingly. And even though you had fishing rights there, it doesn't mean that other tribes would not have travel rights to the same land. Colonists moved into unused land. This notion that if you weren't using the land, that is to say, if you weren't haying the land, if you weren't using the land for grazing your animals, if you weren't planting there, then that's unused. Native people saw no problem with, quote, unused land, but the colonists thought, well, if the Native people aren't using the land, we can use it. And they had a specific tactic in order to expand their holdings. They might have a deed to a certain area, but then you simply let your cows or your pigs roam, and within time they're off your land and they're onto native land, destroying native crops, etc. The Native people would complain, end up having to move, and eventually give up the land. So the animals were kind of the first line of offense to create expanded land. People often ask about exploitation and kind of this notion that, well, this was pristine land that the Native people occupied solely without any change to the land. Well, that's not true. They engineered things. First of all, the land you're sitting on right now was burned off twice a year in order to keep it clear and open. Why? Easier to hunt, easier to travel. Okay? And when Miles Standish came here in 1632 to establish a trading post over on the Kickamuit River, he thought this land was terrific because it looked just like England. It was all ready for farmers to move in, and that's why he was one of the first purchasers on that deed in 1653. He never lived here. At the same time, they both selectively protected species. Okay? It wouldn't necessarily feed wild animals, but you would manage the wild animals, if you will, and they had custom designed habitats, practiced common sense conservation of trees, soil, fish stocks, and water. So both sides were looking at the natural resources in a conservation way. Differing views of trade. Pokanokets saw trade as a means of establishing social stability and enhancing cooperation. Remember, this is a group of people for whom collective ownership was important, and trade was a way of enhancing not just your possessions, but the possessions of the people, the tribe there. natural resources comprise a common pot. And the sense was that food for one is food for all. You do not raise your food for yourself. And in fact, in most settlements, you would come in and literally find a common pot, sometimes made of what's called soapstone, but you would keep a pot and people would put vegetables and meat in that pot as they contributed, and everyone was free to take from that as they were hungry. So this whole communal notion was very much alive and well. Whereas the English notion is, you build yourself a building with, 4 walls, you close the door, and what's yours is yours, and what his is not, okay? And you don't welcome people in, despite your whatever Christian background, because you're there to protect your own, right? Different views of gender. We talked a little bit about that in work, but Native women took leadership roles. And in fact, have you all heard of Weetamoo? Okay. She was in the Pokanoket tribe, just over in Tiverton, in that area, and was known as a well-respected leader throughout her life. But when it came to negotiating with the English, they wouldn't talk to her. She's a woman. What right does she have to enforce contracts? So it wasn't long before the Native people caught on to that and began working through some of the men who the English were willing to talk with. But it didn't mean they gave up leadership roles for women. Family and social structure. English families are hierarchical. Wealth is transmitted within families down through generations. And as I said before, everyone knew his or her place. Native families were extensive, relationships complex with wide tribal boundaries. There was intermarriage among tribes, and leaders were chosen along bloodlines with women choosing the male leaders. Somebody like that here?
Yes.
There was no wealth to inherit, and status was determined by personal strength, bravery, and knowledge. Okay, because you're not passing down wealth. In fact, if you had possessions, you were likely to be buried with them. Okay. Besides, what good was it to have possessions to carry around from settlement to settlement? Having possessions made no sense at all if you were going to move in the wintertime inland to your winter settlement, and your summer settlement might move every year or two because you're going to run out of wood. You might find hunting more scarce at that time. So the idea that there was a single settlement in one place, a village, a city, a town, if you will, is absolutely antithetical. The idea was you moved to where the resources were. The English notion is you establish one place and you bring the resources to there. Okay? And you think about that in terms of our expenditures for transportation. Let's see, moving resources and people. Think about Boston traffic on Route 3. How are we doing with that? Might we do better had we learned to move with the resources in the community? There's an alternative vision of how the English got along with the natives that lasted for just a couple of years when Thomas Morton created a colony up near Weymouth called Marymount. He took an exploratory trip in 1622, but by 1623 complained of intolerance in certain elements of the Puritan community. Morton was not a favorite of the Puritans, but he had his own vision of how people should live, and in particular, how people should get along with native folks. His view of the Pokanokets was that they were fully self-sufficient, far and beyond any measure of the average European of the day. That is to say, they were doing a better job of living successfully than the English were. He admired them. Whereas the Puritans contended that the native people were wasting their land because they didn't graze animals on it. Morton began this utopian project in which the colonists were declared freemen and were given a degree of integration with local Algonquin culture. That is to say, intermarriage. Okay, men. This is the only time I can find when it was tolerated for English men and native women to consort, if you will. It would be extremely punishable by law in other English colonies. His beliefs were blasted by Bradford. He was driven out, put in stocks in Plymouth, and finally marooned on the desert isle of Shoals off the coast of New Hampshire. So it wasn't a long-lasting settlement. Legal control. In decrees of 1630s and 40s, the Pilgrims attempted to corner the market on Indian fur trade. They licensed truck houses or trading posts. That's the trading post, the Hoxie House down on the Cape. But some version of that existed on the Kickamuit River here in 1632. This was a hot place for trading then. There was a ban on the sale of alcohol and firearms and fishing vessels and horses to Indians, and religious education was required, prohibiting any expression of pagan worship. This sounds very Puritan in terms of the style, which is to take people and outlaw the things that you do not like, rather than permitting two cultures to live side by side, more as Thomas Morton's view of things. Differing views of justice. Indians were allowed to bring their own tribe members to justice and punish them according to tribal customs. That was in the agreement, the Treaty of 1621. But by the 60s, English courts began trying Indians and deciding on their punishment. If you want to read a good account of what led up to the King Philip War, read Igniting King Philip's War about John Sassamon, who was a praying Indian who was murdered, left below the ice up in Middleborough, and 3 native men were accused, hung, except for one who the rope broke, and he then said it was the other 2 guys who did it, but they killed him anyway. But that was outside of the original agreement, to have native men judged and executed by Englishmen for a crime between 2 Indians. Conflicts increased. We're now up to 1670. By this time, Oso McClendon had died. His son Wamsuta had taken over, but was the native people believed was poisoned after a visit to Plymouth. When he died, that his son Metacomet, or who we know as King Philip, took over. During that time, from 1670 to 1675, there were increasing encroachments on the Indian plantings, and in fact, the native population was confined to this area. There was a fence on Franklin Street in Warren, all the way across from water to water, to keep the English animals out of native property down there. All of the native people were living south of that land, on the one area held exclusively for the tribes, and that area only included about 700 people at that time. The population had dropped by about 90% over the years because of continued outbreaks of infectious diseases and the stress of colonization. As the English began trying and punishing Indian crimes and demanding that they turn in their guns, the pressure built for war. Philip himself didn't lead the charge into the war. In fact, some of his warriors began the war over here on Child Street, where there was a farm that was raided, and in time the native people the warriors began burning colonial towns and houses, brought the militia down from Boston, set up at the Miles Garrison up in what's now Swansea, and tried to chase Philip down into Bristol. He had escaped, gone around across the Taunton River and back up and all the way up to Northampton, led first with the Nipmunks, and then after the Great Swamp Fire in December of 1675, the Narragansetts joined the war effort and almost won. They could have driven the English back to England. Many had left because of the war, but it wasn't until the tribe began running out of ammunition and food that the English got the upper hand. Killed King Philip down here on what's Mount Hope farmland in Bristol, and that essentially ended the war here. The war continued in some respects up in Maine for a number of years. But that's the 1-minute description of the King Philip War, so I'm not going into all the details. There are plenty of books about it that you can read. I'm more interested in what led up to the war and what happened afterwards. The war crippled both sides. It was the bloodiest conflict in American history, still is. 52 English towns were attacked and burned, a dozen more destroyed, more than 2,500 colonists died, and probably twice that number of native people. It was devastating. It took 100 years for people to get over that war, and it affected the history of this place. But most importantly, it affected the treatment of native people. The English were used to battles in which your goal was to kill everybody on the other side. That was the whole point. The native people saw warfare as the opportunity to take over control of land, of an area. And their effort was not to kill everybody. In fact, you didn't want to kill them because you wanted to bring them into your tribe in some enslaved fashion, but you wanted to grow your tribe. And that's what would happen. If the Narragansetts had come into this area, this would be Narragansett territory, and the Pokanokets would be absorbed into the Narragansett tribe. That kind of thing happened over and over again. That's what warfare was about from their point of view. But when they saw how the English were fighting the wars, and between the massacre of the Pequots in 1637 and the Great Swamp Massacre, in which hundreds and hundreds of men, women, and children were burned alive, they saw a different way of war being conducted and began doing the same thing. So who learned scalping? The native people. From whom? People in England. English warfare was designed to kill. If we did a whole presentation on Roger Williams, we'd learn that he grew up 100 yards from Smithfield in London, where they were burning people at the stake as, weekly while he was growing up. That was the world of the English, okay? And who's the heathen and who are the savages here? Let's get this straight. Crisis civility. After the war, they experienced a catastrophic loss of their culture. Colonists purchased more and more of the land all the way to the west coast with Manifest Destiny. And by the time the Indians woke to the threat posed by the waves of land-hungry settlers, they were often politically and militarily too weak to react decisively, according to Weidensaul and the First Frontier. So the question is, was the Massasoit wrong? Should he have not entered into that agreement on April Fool's Day of 1621? So the message from the current Sagamore, it was the Massasoit met a comet. Okay, in other words, met a comet. This son, second son, was also a Massasoit. See, the title goes with it. This person had the vision and foresight that he was not sharing his territory with the English, but losing it. That he would have no country left if things continued on his present course. Philip told his friend John Easton, "But little remains of my ancestors' domain. I am resolved not to see the day when I have no country." This greed for land and clash of cultures in Plymouth plantations eventually led to the King Philip War. And that's how Winds of Thunder, the Sagamore of the tribe who lives in Barrington right now, that's the current native view of what led to the war and what the consequence was. Following the war, Native people were sold into slavery. They were misled, saying that if you surrender, you'll be fine, and then they were killed. There was a lot of deception going on after that time. So those who surrendered got far worse treatment. Many were shipped to Barbados and enslaved there. Why? Why wouldn't you enslave somebody here? You enslave a native person here, and they go to work for you, and what happens at 3 in the morning? They book. Out they go. You send them to Barbados, they have nowhere they can go. They don't know anybody and don't know how to survive there. Okay? And then eventually they were traded for African people who also didn't know where they were here. Yeah, quite a system. Huh? Those who surrendered to slavery often thought it would be worse to be enslaved in Barbados than to be alive, so they killed themselves. Okay, it was that bad. Tribal rule. Within 57 years of English permanent settlement in southern New England, that's the 1620, autonomous tribal rule was systematically destroyed through encroachment, legal repression, and war. There's no evidence that the Puritans saw themselves as invaders, but much that they saw themselves as benefactors. This is the great irony of the age. Okay? So even while that was happening, they saw nothing wrong with it. Indian culture has been erased, particularly in the 19th century. If you read, Gene O'Brien has a wonderful book called Firstings and Lastings, in which he talks about how there was an effort throughout the 19th century to write about the first village, meaning colonial village, the first house, meaning colonial house, the first leader, meaning colonial leader, and then the last Indian, the last of the Mohegans, all the lasts that story was meant to say, there are no more natives left, they're all gone, this land is ours. Well, that wasn't the truth. In fact, there were thousands of native people still here, surviving as well as they could, and this notion of the death of the Indian was perpetrated as a way of erasing the culture. Are you aware that Rhode Island tried to get rid of all native people in 1880 by redefining them? You could either be white or black. There was no category for Indian. Fortunately, that got overturned. And then there was a reservation established for the Narragansett people. No other reservation, despite the fact there are at least 7 other tribes in Rhode Island, none of whom have land of their own. The Rhode Island last Indians on Nantucket, you read all these stories about the last Indian here and the last Indian, and none of it's true. They aren't the last. There are many Indians here. It could have been different. In Fissures in the Rock, Richard Archer writes, had disease not decimated the original inhabitants, had English migration been more gradual, had power been more evenly distributed, had interdependence lasted longer, perhaps the wary cooperation of the early years might have developed into a more comprehensive cultural exchange and some form of bicultural society. I keep looking, and I have yet to find a place in the world where that's happened. That's the unfortunate story of colonial settlement worldwide. So here's the tribe today. Here's Phil Guy, who's the Sagamore. This is Deborah Running Deer Afsada, who is the council president. These are members of the council. They still hold ceremonial events at Mount Hope at the seat. I was just there last Thursday. They do a Thanksgiving festival, have over 300 Pokanokets gathering down at Mount Hope Farm for an annual celebration. And you can see performances, if you will. If you go to the big drum ceremony in September, right down at Roger Williams Memorial in downtown Providence, you will have an opportunity to meet the tribes. Better yet, you don't have to wait that long or go that far, because at Burrs Hill Park, on July 5th, write this down, the day after the 4th of July, the tribe will be at Burrs Hill Park and inviting everyone to come and meet the people who were here before the Pilgrims arrived in 1620. The basis of the conflict today, Pokanokets see the history of the past 400 years differently than what is usually taught. They continue to be disappeared and made invisible. Part of that is misnaming them Wampanoags. They're asserting their Aboriginal rights under the UN Charter. They're not interested in being under the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the U.S. government, otherwise known as federal recognition, because there are a lot of limitations once you're under that agreement. You cannot act as an independent nation. Whereas under the United Nations Charter, they are an Aboriginal tribe or nation that has the same rights as any other nation in the world. They want support to get their sacred land back, in particular the land at Mount Hope, and we're working on that. Recognize Nathaniel Philbrick, who wrote Mayflower. If you only want to read one book about this, read Mayflower. It's fabulous. He does a great job of telling that story. The story I just told, but he does it in much better terms. And he correctly describes them as Pokanoket, not Wampanoag. Well, we met Philbrick just last, when was that, December. And the Sagamore had a chance to meet him, and we're getting together on March 6th to talk some more so that Philbrick can learn more about the tribe that he wrote about. Okay. If you're ever down in Griswold, Connecticut, look for this painting. That's a painting of George Washington with his personal bodyguard, Simeon Simons, who was a Massasoit of the Pokanokets, a descendant of King Philip, who served Washington during the Revolutionary War. I'll end with the prayer of the Sagamore today. This is Bill Guy and his statement: we cannot go back and relive the past. So our prayer today is that all the descendants of the Pokanoket Nation will find forgiveness and understanding for what transpired in the past. We pray for a better understanding between the Pokanoket people and the inhabitants of Bristol County, Rhode Island, Bristol County, Massachusetts, and the inhabitants of the ancestral realm of the Pokanoket Nation Confederacy, so that we can truly believe and be one nation under God, with liberty and justice for all.
Iuta.
Iuta. Okay, that's what I have to say. We have a few minutes. We have time for some questions. Tony.
What was the basis for the disagreement between Narragansett and Pokanoket?
The basis for the disagreement? Generations of conflict. There were simply two tribes that weren't going to get along, even though there was contact between them, but they...
No specific...
No one specific thing, but they came in fact, one of the first things that resulted from the treaty with the Pilgrims, Massasoit was attacked by Narragansetts in 1623, and it was the Miles Standish who came to his aid, rescued him there. So the Narragansetts were breathing down their neck. In fact, the Narragansetts even had plans to go into the Massachusetts territory, because the Massachusetts were wiped out even more than the Pokanokets along the coast, which is why when Boston was settled, there were practically no native people there. They all died during that plague. Other questions?
What about other tribes like the Mohegans? Were they like allied with?
Well,
I remember reading
during the
something
war,
about
right? King Philip tried to get an agreement with the Mohegans. They got into a little problem because one of his men killed one of their men, one thing or another. And what they thought was going to be an alliance. It turned out the Mohegans actually went on the English side.
Yeah.
Had they formed an alliance, though, that was early in the spring of 76. They could very well have driven the English back to the coast. Whether they would have sent everybody packing is hard to say, but it would have been a whole different outcome of the war. Right? Yeah.
Two questions.
Truly, yeah.
Quick one, what is the difference between the title Sagamore and Massasoit?
Massasoit is a title that's no longer used. They retired that after Philip's death. Sagamore is the next line down, if you will, and that's why Bill Guy is not called the Massasoit, but he is the Sagamore, and he has chiefs under him, often referred to as sachems. So you'll hear that term as well.
Second question.
Yep.
What is the controversy between the Pokanokets and the Mashpee and maybe Akina?
Well, if I could describe that briefly and accurately, I would, but let's just say that in the same way that the Pokanokets and the Narragansetts didn't get along, the Pokanokets and the Mashpees are not exactly allied, if you will. And in fact, when that monument over at Burrs Hill was put in by the Mashpee tribe, the Pokanokets were right there with their placards complaining because that's their territory. And here's another tribe. The one thing that stands today as the constant rule is that you do, as one tribe member, you do not go onto the land of another tribe without asking permission. And the Mashpees had not done that. On the other hand, whether they would have been successful in gathering things, you know the story about the Burrs Hill burial ground over here? That we had a railroad that came through in 1854. Okay, the one that went from Providence to Bristol. Okay, it's now the bike path. All right, goes through Burrs Hill Park there. Well, starting in 1854, as they were digging, they began finding skeletons and burial objects, ceramics and pots and one thing or another, but had no idea what they were. So people would take things home or whatever. It wasn't until 1913 when the director of this library, Charles Carr, who was an amateur archaeologist, decided that he was going to do something about that, got permission from the railroad, which had owned Burrs Hills, plural, because Burrs Hills at the time was just a series of gravel mounds over there, and got permission to dig and found 42 native grave sites, and he knew they were native sites, and removed the objects from those grave sites, took some to the museum just in the room above you, and then some to the Haffenrapper, and some to the Hay Museum in New York, and some up to Harvard. And that's where those items remained until members of the Mashpee tribe began coming here in the 90s and saying, we want our burial objects back because the federal law requires you to release anything that was a burial object. And my wife, who was director at the time, and I packed up the things that belonged to them, and they carried them off a couple of years later. Those are now in a 10 by 10 foot vault underground underneath the memorial over in the park, and they were returned in a ceremony in May of 2017. So that's how they got there. And that's why we're going to be doing more powwows and celebrations over there, because that, along with the rest of this land, is native land. They have no problem with it being a park. In fact, that's much better that it's a park than it would be if it were just a housing development. Okay? And the town has been very cooperative in this process.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Wasn't the name Pokanoket outlawed after the King
That's
Philip
right.
War? You
Yep.
were not allowed to use it anywhere.
Couldn't say you were Pokanoket, couldn't
Right.
speak the Pokanoket language, and if you identified yourself as Pokanoket and you were a male over the age of 14, you could be shot on sight.
What?
Yeah. Well, they did a lot of that. I'm talking massacres here, okay? Go up to Turner's Falls sometime, find out how 400 men, women, and children were killed, driven in over the falls, at Turner's Falls there, all as part of the King Philip War effort.
What date would that be?
Yeah.
76?
Early 76.
Wow.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
This is sort of separate. Is the Hafenreffer museums ever open?
Not to the public, now. You can make special arrangements to go there. Okay, you have to get a hold of the people there and request permission, et cetera, et cetera. By the will, Rudolf Heffenreffer, who among other things started the Narragansett beer, a number of things had mills over in Fall River. But he acquired the land in 1912. When he died in 1953, he made his family then made arrangements. In 1955, the land was given to Brown University with the idea that it would house his extensive collection of native materials that he had himself had collected, and then became the repository of over 1 million items from all over the world are there now. They're in the process of moving them to Providence because Brown University got a $5 million grant from the Mellon Foundation a year ago that gives them 4 years to remove everything from that location. So they've hired people and they're in the process of doing that now. So we know that they will be off that property in 3 years. What we would like to see is the Pokanokets have that property back, because they own nothing. Other questions? Wow, gee, I've covered everything.